So there's an apocryphal story about David Foster Wallace from that biography. I think it's called Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, where he's sitting in philosophy lecture at Kenyon College. The lecture is about to be on German idealism, and apparently he very loudly leaned back in his chair and went, "We're going up." I don't know if that's true or not. I always found that amusing, and I always think about that every time I teach something related to German idealism or to the Transcendentalists, because today we are doing something effectively like going up. We're going to be dealing with a lot of very abstract philosophical concepts. Fortunately for you guys, I've taught this now. This is probably my 7th year doing something with Transcendentalism. I know it inside and out. I've read a lot about the Transcendentalists, studied Transcendentalism under one of the best scholars of American Transcendentalism, who actually just published a 2-volume work on Emerson and the idea of solipsism. You can go look him up. This is Dr. Cole Curcio. This is Emerson and Other Minds. I think it was published Harvard University Press. Very good book. I've read parts of it. I've not read the entire thing, but I've read a good portion of it. And we are going to be dealing with Transcendentalism today. I'm going to provide an overview of the key unit vocab, as I've done for previous units. I've got my sort of cheap PowerPoint here. You're going to see some of the images not so great when we're dealing with abstract philosophical terms, but I made the best of it. But we're going to go over everything I think you need to know to have a grasp on the text we're going to look at in this unit. And so with no further ado, we will get to the first part, which is the philosophical foundations of Transcendentalism. So where these ideas are coming from. Because you're going to see Transcendentalism represents a complete 180 from everything that we've seen in the Knickerbocker School. So the Knickerbocker School is primarily Telluric. It is primarily out of New York, in the interior of the country. It's concerned with nationalism. It's literally the exact opposite of Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, which starts to, I would say, it has its heyday in the 1840s, starts to build tractions towards beginning of 1830s. And Transcendentalism represents a return to New England ascendancy. It represents an intellectual rather than sort of Telluric and folk culture, a focus on philosophy, a refocus on theology in certain aspects. Again, hyper abstract, hyper intellectualized, and we see the removal of standard literary forms. So the primary genre of Transcendentalism is going to be the essay. Now, not exclusively, but it is primarily the essay. And we see, the receding of the novel, the play. Poetry still remains an aspect, but decentralization of poetry, that kind of explosion of literary forms, still going on in the major literary market, but during the period of American Transcendentalism, which is the period we tend to remember. Now, of course, other things are going on in other parts of America, but if you look at your Norton, you would think the 1840s were just Transcendentalism. And to a certain extent, there's an element of that, because the most important people, the hoi polloi, the opposite of the hoi polloi, the patrician class of New England, the Boston Brahmin, the most educated people were fascinated by Transcendentalism. So the people with the most cultural capital are all very invested in these ideas, in reading the major publications of the Transcendentalist authors and the Dial, which is their literary magazine. And Transcendentalism's, a cultural ascendancy and grip on America only gets stronger with time. In fact, I would say pretty much until the 1960s, everything is a response to Emerson in some way. And in fact, some scholars have made the case, and I would be 100% in agreement with this, the 1840s, what happened to the elites in the 1840s with Brook Farm, Fruitlands, communal living, utopian socialism, transcendentalist ideas, seizing Orientalist text in Oriental quote-unquote thought, so on and so forth, is basically what happens to the popular American culture in the 1960s, where the hippie movement is sort of a watered-down, for the hoi polloi version of Transcendentalism, which I would 100% agree with. The 1840s and the 1960s, it's like two repeats of each other. That's my opinion, and we can get into that a little bit later. But the point being, for 120 years, almost all of American culture is a response to Emerson. I would actually say I would make the concrete claim that when Emerson publishes Nature, we have exactly 100 years of response to Emerson. And with the end of World War II, that response becomes attenuated or becomes bastardized in a sort of cheap version. By the end of the 1960s, the Emersonian dominance on American culture has changed. American literary, cultural, aesthetic concerns have moved elsewhere. But I legitimately think all of the major modernist authors, all the realist authors, all the naturalist authors, certainly the authors of the Gothic period of American Romanticism, they're all a response to Emerson. The Great Gatsby, what we remember as being the quote-unquote great American novel, which we'll talk about when we get to Gatsby, it is a response to Emerson, pure and simple. There is nothing else to it. This would be my claim. And so from that point of view, we have to understand the Transcendentalists, even though they represent a small portion of the total literary production in the United States, they end up being the most important authors. And this is often true. Vanguard or sort of elite movements, even if they're not incredibly popular during their own time, if they're popular among the right people, they become considered canonical. That's a claim that I would make. Cool. So the first background term, if you want to say term, that we need to understand in relation to Transcendentalism is Immanuel Kant. Okay? Now, I don't know why it looks so weird on the camera right here. Anyway, Immanuel Kant was not read by Emerson. Okay? Emerson never read Kant. Thoreau never read Kant. Margaret Fuller most likely did not read Kant. Like, Walt Whitman did not read Kant. So, who did read Kant? Well, other Americans read Kant, and the American Transcendentalists read authors who were familiar with Kant. Most famously, Coleridge. Everyone was familiar with Coleridge. Coleridge was a major inspiration on these writers. Emerson actually meets Coleridge in person when he goes on his grand tour of Europe, which he does backwards. It's an interesting story we might get to with the Emerson biography. But Kant was sort of in the air. Now, again, no one had picked up the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. No one had picked up, the Critique of Judgment or any of these major texts. But this sort of air or ethos or zeitgeist that was created in the Protestant world by Kant is picked up by American authors. And the reason for that is, you have to understand, America always saw Germany as the focal point of European culture because Germany was the strongest, most culturally respected, most politically respected, even though obviously not unified at this point. What do you want to say? Protestant European culture. Where else are you going to look to? You have England, but America is always trying to put itself in contradistinction to England. And English Protestantism, very, very, very different from German Protestantism because, of course, you have High Church Anglicans, you're going to have the beginning of the Oxford movement. Things are really complicated in the Anglican scene. And then, of course, you have Norway, you have Sweden, you have, a couple other small Protestant states in Europe, but the major states in the European game outside of England are Catholic still. Portugal, Spain, even though they're entering into a period of decline. France. Obviously, in Eastern Europe, it's a war between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. But Protestantism, as a European cultural focal point, has its origin in Germany. And so Americans are always looking to Germany to gather what they can take for American Protestant culture. Now, Kant's big contribution is in response to David Hume. And this is in a very short book I highly recommend reading, especially if turns out you're interested in these ideas, called The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. I remember reading it. I had just turned 21. I was traveling that day. I was like 8 hours. I had an 8-hour layover in, I think it was Houston Airport. But anyway, it was like I had nothing to do. I had a copy of the Prolegomena on me, and I'm like, I'm just going to read this and see how it goes. And it took me all 8 hours. Like, I was going so slow. And then, I would go and I would look something up, and then I would go back and, look something up again, go back. I was doing everything I could to try to understand it. But when I finally got it, when it finally clicked, it blew my mind. It completely blew my mind. It changed the way I saw everything. In fact, I would say, even though I'm not an idealist, that was one of the greatest philosophical experiences I have ever had, was reading Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. And what it is it's the opening part is interestingly biographical, where he talks about the influence of David Hume on him. And he basically says he is trying to save metaphysics. So metaphysics is, and we're going to talk a lot about metaphysics in this vocab session. Metaphysics is that which is beyond the physics. Like, etymologically, that's what it means. And so physics is the study of material objects. And so the question is, what is there behind matter? This is what we call, and we'll get to this when we get to the section on metaphysics and cosmology. One term for this might be something like form. So, for example, this is an easy way to get the idea of form. You have a table, and the table is composed of matter. It's wood. It exercises certain properties like hardness or solidity. It takes up volume. It has density. You could say it has whatever, it has this many nicks on it. The grain is this thick. You could talk about all these different properties. It's rectangular, but it's not a perfect rectangle because it has all these different nicks and dents. Whatever, but you go, this is a desk or this is a table. Let's go with table. This is a table. But then you could see another table that's completely different. Maybe it's gray, it's made out of plastic, it's circular. Then you could see another table that's gray and plastic made out of circular, but someone in like red marker put an X on it. Then you see another table that's like mahogany and a triangle. But like you recognize all of these tables as being tables. In spite of the fact that their material or physical properties are different, your mind creates a mental category or a form called table. Now, create is a loaded term because Plato obviously wouldn't say create. It depends if you're a nominalist or an essentialist. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the point is, when you generalize and you look at all these different objects, what is it that makes you say that they're all tables? For Plato essentially says, look, we have a preconceived idea, what is called an innate idea. Think back to the Enlightenment when we talked about tabula rasa, innate ideas. We have an innate idea of tableness. The form of table is something that exists in our mind. Why? Because the form of table is downstream from other more abstract properties. So for Plato, we have our origin with the one, the monad, the absolute God. And our soul belongs to that realm. Our soul is a thing immortal, like the one, the monad, God, whatever you want to call it. We are immortal like God. And so the idea is we participate in that immortality. We participate in certain aspects of those divine perfections that emanate from God. And our natural realm is with the one, is with the monad. We'll talk about what that natural realm is. But God, being one, experiences unity. And unity is the highest property, but within unity there are sub-properties called transcendentals: goodness, beauty, and truth. And so table is downstream from that because the table experiences certain abstract qualities like its hardness, like its utility, so on and so forth, that allow it to be good. As an example, so a table that is good at, a table that we would call a good table. See how many times I stumble in this lecture because it's a bit abstract. You got to really think about it. A table that is a good table is a table that performs the functions of a table well. And so you can put stuff on it, it lasts a long time, right? Like whatever you think a table needs to do. If a table is good at being a table, it experiences goodness in a moral sense. It is functional as a table. In fact, Aristotle's definition of moral goodness for human beings is that human beings are good at doing what human beings do. And human beings are distinct for Aristotle because of our ability to reason. So for Aristotle, the more rational you are, the more moral you are. Because what it really means is that you're good at being a human being. And so a table that is good at being a table does what tables do, and it participates in the transcendentals, which participate in unity, which participate in the one or the monad. Very abstract. But the idea of table is not something we can experience by way of sense perception. Like I can touch an actual table, but the idea of table that unites all possible tables, which are infinite, there are an infinite number of possible tables. Isn't that crazy? It's a limited infinity. If you know calculus, that's not super crazy. But it's a limited infinity in the sense that like there are other infinities that are bigger than that. The infinity of God is bigger than the infinity of possible tables. That logically makes sense if you think about it for a couple minutes. But the infinity of possible tables, I am still able, in spite of the fact that I have not seen all possible tables, I am able to come up with a mental category or remember a mental category, or whatever you want to say, of tableness that allows me to generalize across all possible tables. And that ideal table is the form of table. And that's a metaphysical, what do you want to say? That's a metaphysical analysis of the table. Because I'm not looking at the physical properties anymore. I'm talking about the idea of table, which transcends matter. The idea of table, which transcends matter. Now, David Hume, moving into the realm of skepticism and nominalism, Hume's work is basically going to, and this goes back to the Enlightenment, I'm not going to redo all of David Hume here, but Hume effectively says is we cannot create absolute a priori rules about experience because experience is chaos. And it is totally possible that our generalizations about objects, about moral goodness, about beauty, about truth, so on and so forth, are just invented categories of the mind. So this is a nominalist perspective. They're invented categories of the mind that we use to make sense of experience, But it's totally possible, for example, if we make up, let's say we have an a priori rule that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. It's certainly possible that even though all of our possible experiences prior to this say the sun is going to rise tomorrow, the sun doesn't rise tomorrow. It's possible that, whatever, gravity changes tomorrow and all of a sudden I float up to the ceiling. Anything is possible for David Hume. He says we can't actually create concrete, 100% apodictically true laws of the universe. We only ever deal with probabilities. And if you're confused on that, go back to the lecture on the Enlightenment or leave a question down below. I can explain that a little bit. But Hume's like, all we have are probabilities. We can have degrees of certainty, but we will never approach 100% certainty. And for Kant, both biographically, because Kant was kind of a weird guy, but also as a German, also as a man of the Enlightenment, Kant hated the idea that we couldn't be certain of anything. And so what Kant is trying to do is figure out, okay, how can I rescue metaphysics? Because what Hume says scares me. And Aristotle's response to Hume, because there were skeptics in Aristotle's time, Aristotle's response is, my truths are self-evident. And Kant is like, that is not good enough, which I love. Because even, like, for example, in the sort of traditionalist, conservative Catholic world, there's a lot of hyping up of Aristotle, which I think is a good thing, and Aristotle in relation to Thomas Aquinas, which is an even a better thing, because St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the greatest philosophers ever. That's just a fact. But part of that hyping up is, well, Aristotle says certain things are self-evident, so we're not going to do any philosophical investigation beyond that. So every cause has an effect. Hume's being stupid. We all know causes have effects. That's just intuitively obvious. That's self-evident. Well, I don't like the idea of self-evident either. So this is why I actually love Kant, because Kant takes Hume's objection very seriously. He doesn't dismiss it. Like, there are certain dismissive objections of idealism and of Hume, like, well, you can't deny the reality of pain. Well, actually, you can't. You could if you wanted to, right? You can take skepticism as far as you want to take it. And so most people won't do that. They'll just say, if a rock hits me in the face, it's going to hurt. And they'll take that as an apodictically true law. But when you're thinking philosophically, that doesn't work. And so what Kant wants to do is to recover a way to answer David Hume and to answer these objections and say, no, here we have apodictic certainty. Here we have an a priori, which he's going to call the synthetic a priori. I'm not going to get into that too much because this is not a lecture on Kant, but it's fascinating stuff. We have a way of coming to certainty about the world in spite of the fact that a certain degree of what Hume says is correct. And so the way Kant saves metaphysics is he bites the bullet. He says, Hume is correct. We cannot know anything about the external world. So, like, actual objects, what Kant calls things in themselves, we are completely ignorant about. We're in the dark. We're in a black box. We know nothing about the world. So, like, look around you. Like, look around the room. You see whatever. I see a couch. I see a television. I see books. I see this, that, the other. What Kant would say is, you're actually not seeing those objects as they actually are. And, like, what actually is outside of you, you don't even know. It's not like, oh, it's a television, but like television itself, for Kant, is a mental product. It's something you have produced and have mapped onto reality. You've externalized these concepts. And so for Kant, I don't ever experience the thing in itself. Well, what do I experience then? I experience an externalization of my mind that is mapped onto the thing of itself, okay? And what these are the Kantian categories. Oh, it cut off a little bit. Well, you've got the 4 Kantian categories. And basically the idea is, within these Kantian categories, these are all the things that our minds are constantly doing. They're ejecting or shooting out or mapping on to things in themselves in such a way that we are able to process them. And even though I may not ever know anything about a thing in itself, I can know something about my own consciousness with 100% certainty. And so this is really interesting, right? So for example, if we look at the 4th Kantian category, modality, possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, necessity, contingency. So for example, if I look at an object, I am already conscious of the fact that it exists, or of the non-existence of something else in the place where that object is. It is not possible, this is the idea of the Kantian categories, it is not possible for me to imagine a world without necessity or contingency, or without possibility or impossibility. These mental categories are mapped out from my mind onto reality. And so in a certain sense, and now this is where other idealists are going to take it, and in particular Emerson's going to take this to the next level. When I look outside at the world, I am experiencing all of the things that are inside of me. In a certain sense, I am experiencing myself. Why? Because the very idea of existence, non-existence, or causality, or the idea of, again, something being real, negation, limitation, singularity versus plurality, okay? These ideas are necessarily mapped onto reality. I can never avoid this. And so as a result of that, if I must experience reality this way, and I can't know anything about things in themselves, as Hume says, well, where are these things coming from? And Kant says, well, they're coming from the interior of consciousness, and of those things we can be certain. I may not be certain about the exterior world, but the way in which I perceive the exterior world and the categories through which these things are filtered through, like light coming through a stained glass window, those things I can actually make apodictic conclusions about. And what Kant tries to do in the three major critiques after the Prolegomena, which are the Critique of Pure Reason, which is one of the most complicated texts ever, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment, which is the least read, but I think actually the best, the Critique of Judgment. What Kant tries to do is rescue the three Platonic Transcendentals, which are truth in the Critique of Pure Reason, goodness in the Critique of Practical Judgment, and beauty in the Critique of the Critique of Practical Reason, and then in the Critique of Judgment, beauty. And so the idea is, look, I have rescued traditional Platonic metaphysics from the skepticism of Hume. And I have made it so that we can obtain absolute certainty about certain philosophical truths independently of revelation, which is what Christendom relied on for 1,000 years, or what was relied on in the Islamic world or the Hindu world. Well, we believe revelation to be true 100% a priori on the basis of faith, which is higher than reason. We talked about that a lot in the Enlightenment. Well, Kant, as an Enlightenment thinker, is going to go, no, I can't. Even though he identifies as a Christian, he say it is not good enough for me to say I believe revelation on faith. Well, then how can I come to certainty about the world? That is what Kant does in the three critiques, is say, no, we can come to certainty about certain philosophical truths, about how human beings should act in the Critique of Practical Reason, about what is beautiful and what is not in the Critique of Judgment, what is true, what is false in the Critique of Pure Reason. We are capable of coming to those absolute truths by way of an investigation of what's in here, because what's in here is actually exteriorized in what's out there. We don't know the thing itself, but we do see an exteriorization of our own minds. So in a certain sense, when you're looking outside of you, you're seeing all the things that are inside of you. And when we come to certainty about that, we can actually start to build and reconstruct metaphysics. So I have saved metaphysics from the brink. And I do think that's what Kant did. I'm not a Kantian. I have a lot of problems with Kant, but there are very few philosophers I have more respect for than Kant. What Kant did was revolutionary. It was just absolutely revolutionary. And I don't think anyone can deny that. But why do I bring this up? Well, Emerson's going to take this a step further when we get to his idea of the oversoul. And I'm going to talk about this in a section where it becomes more relevant. For Emerson, the idea of the oversoul is there's no distinction between my mind and the thing itself. There is only one universal substance called the oversoul. Or if you're a Platonist, you would call it the absolute, the one, the monad. And Emerson is, interestingly enough, he calls this also self, which is true, right? Because if you're a pantheist, let's actually skip to this term. Oh no, do I not have it here? Okay, it's later. If you're a pantheist, you believe that all things are God. So everything is God. So like a pile of horse poop is God. The sofa is God. I am God. You are God, right? Everything is God. And it's not that God is in all things. That would be panentheism. It's that, no, all things are God. All of nature is God. The planets are God. Weather is God. It's all just God. And so what Emerson says is that's true, which means that I am God as well. And Emerson says there's only one substance, and it hides from us in the veil of Maya. What is the veil of Maya? It's an idea that's drawn from Hinduism and also from Buddhist texts. Maya just means illusion. Now, a lot of these authors, and this goes back to Orientalism, I'm skipping around a little bit, but it's good. Orientalism is a discipline, okay? So it's not Orientalism in the bad sense of something being Orientalist, meaning racist, perpetuating certain stereotypes about the East. The British Orientalists were a group of intellectuals at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, who, with the expansion of the British Empire, expansion of British trade, begin to take seriously the cultures of the Orient. Yes, in a racist and sort of culturally insensitive way, no one doubts that. But like actually translate the text of, take your pick, right, of the great Indian playwrights, of the great Islamic philosophers, of the four great Chinese novels, right? Like we start to get translations in English of all these things. And they arrive to Boston. And so Emerson and Thoreau later, after they have their disillusionment with Christianity, which we'll talk about, they start reading the text of Hinduism and they're fascinated by it, particularly by one school of Hinduism called Vedanta. And so they read like the Bhagavad Gita, they read the Upanishads, they read the Ramayana. I think it's Emerson who will say the Bhagavad Gita is 1,000 times deeper than the Bible. And so they become very fascinated by Hinduism and a little bit with Buddhism as well. And so this idea of Maya is super interesting to Emerson because Emerson's going to say, well, what Vedanta says is that all things are Atman. They're the highest possible reality. They are God. And the reason we do not perceive things this way, the reason why we perceive difference, like I am not you, I am not the sofa, I am not the television, I am not a tree, I am not a mountain. Why is it I perceive difference between objects if all things are actually the same universal substance? Well, Emerson's going to say the reason we perceive difference is precisely because we are not spiritually educated enough. But if we lift up the veil of illusion, if we start to pierce the veil and see things as they actually are, we will eventually attain a state of God consciousness in which you realize everything is just the one. It is just the monad. It is just the absolute hiding from itself in this eternal game of hide and seek, whereby we perceive things as being different when in fact it's just a dream of a dream. All things are actually just the one, the absolute, the monad. And so for Emerson, quite literally, this is the important thing. It's not that when I look at a mountain landscape, let's say there's a lake and mountains behind it, Kant would say there are things in themselves out there. I don't know what they are, but I do know that my experience of them is mediated by way of these categories that exist in my mind. And so to a certain extent, what I'm really perceiving when I perceive the mountain and the lake is my own consciousness. That's what Kant would say. Emerson is actually going to go a step further, and Emerson is going to say, no, it's not that I'm perceiving the thing in itself, which I know nothing about, mediated through this consciousness. It's actually I am the mountain. There is no distinction between the mountain and myself because we both belong to the same universal substance of which there is only one, called the Oversoul. So when you look out at the beauty of nature, you are actually seeing yourself because you are God. So every single thing about this material reality that appears to have difference, that is part of the veil of Maya or illusion, if I lift up the veil and become spiritually educated, I will realize I am actually all things. I am the ocean. There is no distinction between the ocean and I because we are both the same substance, which is the one, the Oversoul, the monad. This is Emerson's development to Kant's Transcendental Idealism. That's another name for German idealism. Transcendental Idealism, because why? Kant is trying to recover the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty. Emerson does see himself as a Neoplatonist. He's interested in the Platonic Transcendentals. We get the name the Transcendental Club kind of as a joke, but they take the name nonetheless. But the point for Emerson is it's not that we are trying to recover a Platonic schema of the universe or objectivity. It's actually that all things outside of me are myself. And so if you really think about this, and I tell this to my students, Transcendentalism is American individualism taken to its most logical extreme. I'm going to say that one more time because it's very important. Transcendentalism is American individualism taken to its most logical extreme. So we talk about the origins of American individualism in the Enlightenment, in the culture of the self-made man, all these different things that we saw when we look at Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Well, what could be more individualistic than saying, no, it's not just that I can ascend through different class structures, that I can make of my life what I want it to be. What if I actually was God? Like, what if when I look outside, all things that I see with my senses are actually me? They're not even reflections of me. They are me. When I look up at the night sky and see the masses of stars and the nebula and the planets, I see myself, and I am contemplating myself. That's as extreme as individualism you can get, and that is what Transcendentalism is. Good. Okay, so that in German idealism is the school that Kant doesn't quite found it, per se. Kant is one of the early precursors of the idealists, because later you'll see variations in Schopenhauer and Hegel, right? You can go read about all the German idealists. I'm not going to get into them too much. Kant calls his system Transcendental Idealism, obviously, but that's everything I've just covered so far. If you have questions about that, please put them in the comments. And if you're interested, highly recommend taking a look at the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. It is a phenomenal text. Good. We are going to continue talking about philosophical foundations of Transcendentalism. I'm going to take a quick break for a glass of water, and then we'll get back at it with Neoplatonism. All right, I'm back. So I was going to try to keep this video under 90 minutes. We have an hour remaining. We will see if I get through this stuff. I'm going a little slowly, but it is complicated, and it does merit explaining, because if you try to read Emerson and you don't know what you're getting into and you don't have all this background info, you're not going to have any idea like what is going on. Everybody's seen the Emerson quotes everywhere because Emerson's very popular, right? Every man marches to the beat of his own drummer, be thyself, whatever. Like, you see all this sort of pop culture Emerson stuff everywhere. And then people read Self-Reliance, let's say in their high school American Lit class, and no one knows what it's saying. Like, no one. The teacher doesn't know what it's saying. You don't know what it's saying. Because why? You don't know anything about all these philosophical movements. Emerson was super well educated. He knew about all this stuff. You don't know about any of it, and you probably don't even have a background in whatever, the Christianity that Emerson was raised in. You're missing all these sort of cultural contextual elements that would help you understand Emerson. And so Emerson in most American high schools, and quite frankly, I hate to say it, universities as well, is just taught as like watered down self-help, which is awful because Emerson, in spite of the ways that I have struggled with Emerson, like on a personal level for the past 15 years of my life, like I have had back and forth within myself about Emerson. Because Emerson, much like reading the Prolegomena, I remember I was 15. I read The American Scholar for the first time, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind. And it changed my life. I would say actually that's probably the first thing that I read that I can sincerely say it changed my life. It changed from that moment on forward, my life was never the same. And so there are periods in my life where I've been very intense follower of Emerson, periods where I've reacted very strongly against Emerson. It's a personal thing. But the point is, like, I took Emerson very seriously, and I made every effort to understand Emerson. But Emerson, like, at the pop culture level, is not taken seriously. He's treated as a self-help author and is nothing else. In fact, I know an American public school where the teacher, when they get to Emerson, which, like, when I taught Emerson and when I taught the Transcendentalists, it took me 2 months to get through everything. My students hated me by the end of it. They're like, why are we still because it's important, because you can't understand Gatsby, you can't understand, Faulkner, you can't understand anything until you read Emerson. And you can't understand Emerson until you understand the Enlightenment and Puritanism and all this other stuff. But the point being, my students hated me for making them read all this Emerson. Public school, they'll read Emerson for 2 days. They'll do usually Self-Reliance, and then maybe they'll transition to Thoreau and read like a piece of Walden, probably Civil Disobedience, and call it a day. The whole Transcendentalism unit is 3 days, and that's just I'm not going to swear, but that's a huge waste. It's just a waste of everyone's time. And so at this particular public school, what they decided to do was bring in a yoga instructor. It's like, oh, Emerson was interested in the East, and he was interested in yoga and Hinduism, so we're going to do yoga in class and practice meditation for mental health, and that was class. Well, that's something that I'm not going to say out loud. But in any case, back at it, I mentioned that Emerson was highly influenced by Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism is the revival of Platonic philosophy. And so this tradition, you have the early Neoplatonists during the period of like Roman Empire and then later the fall of Rome. Neoplatonism kind of gets buried for a while. In the Renaissance, it's resurrected. Neoplatonism becomes like very, very influential. So it's had some influence in the early Middle Ages, kind of forgotten for a period of time, resurrected in the Renaissance, forgotten again in the Enlightenment, and then resurrected again with the advent of idealism. And what Neoplatonism is, as I mentioned, is a recovery of the Platonic system. Now, it's not that Plato invented a system. He was not a systematizer. But later thinkers in the Platonic tradition, in the Platonic school, will develop certain ideas of Plato's and come up with a synthesis that, like, if you read the Republic, you'll go, that is not what Plato is saying. But it does have some relation to ideas that Plato was concerned with. And so the big idea of the Neoplatonics, now this is not all Neoplatonics, but it's one of the major ideas, is that our soul is a thing eternal and pre-existed in a world called the world of being, where it was an eternal contemplation of the one or the monad. And our soul, against its will, and you can see this, if you know anything about Christian theology and the history of Christian theology, this is super similar to what some of the Gnostic sects say, because some of the Gnostic sects have their influence from Plato. So Gnosticism becomes like an excessively Platonized version of Christianity. Origen, who's later condemned as a heretic for being a Neoplatonist, is an excessively Neoplatonic and excessively Gnostic form of Christianity. The Manichaeans borrowed tons from the Neoplatonists. Like St. Augustine, early, if you read the Confessions of St. Augustine, the first couple books are just about how he himself got involved with the Neoplatonists and realized Christianity was the answer to Neoplatonism. And I'll explain what the differences are in a minute. But the Neoplatonics say the soul is pre-existent. It exists in a realm of eternal contemplation of God. And against its will, it's thrown into the world of matter, which is a prison. So for the Neoplatonics, the world that you and I live in is a prison. Why? In this world, everything changes. And so in the world of form, in the world of being, in the world where we're united with God, God is eternal and God is unchanging. Why is God unchanging and why is that a good thing? Well, if you have a good thing, you necessarily want it to last forever. And so if God did not last forever, God could not be purely good because there would be an absence. And so God's goodness is eternal, his truth is eternal, his wisdom is eternal, his beauty is eternal, any aspect that you could predicate of God is also eternal and unchanging. Because and also the other problem with change is not just that like it would create an absence, but if God were capable of change, that would mean there would be an outside source that could influence God in some way, and whatever that outside source is would be, how would you say it? Would be stronger than God, would be greater than God. This is why we talk about God as being impassible, both in Neoplatonism and in all the major religious traditions. In Hinduism, God is impassible. In Islam, God is impassible. In Christianity, God is impassible. God cannot change. So if the Bible talks about God being angry, it's a metaphor. Don't be stupid. Atheists, please don't be stupid. If we talk about God being angry, it's not a literal anger. Okay, God cannot be angry because if something were to make God angry, it would mean that something could influence God and that thing would be greater than God. So God's anger is purely a metaphor. God is eternal, is unchanging, is absolute, the one, the monad, so on and so forth. And so we exist in that realm. But when we come here, it's a world of eternal, how should I say this? I'm getting animated. It's a world of eternal change. I drink something, I get thirsty again. I wake up, I get tired. I will eventually get sick and die. Like everything is in a constant state of change, in a constant state of flux. And that change is distance from God, is itself not a moral evil, but what we would call a physical evil. Like it is a defect in this world for Plato. And for Plato, yes, and also for the Neoplatonics. And so for that reason, this world is a prison. And having bodies is awful. Having bodies is awful. This is actually the chief difference between Neoplatonism and Christianity, is that, well, there are three major differences. The three major differences between Neoplatonism and Christianity, because Christianity adopts a lot of Neoplatonic thought in the text of the early church fathers and uses the Neoplatonic vocabulary to describe absolutely everything. So there is a relation. But the point is, the major differences between Christianity and Neoplatonism are Christians accept that the body is a good thing. So they say, no. Having a body actually makes us superior to beings without bodies. So human beings are superior to the angels. So in our unfallen state where we had what were called glorified bodies prior to the fall of man, a Christian theologian like St. Augustine, St. Basil, take your pick, St. John Chrysostom, they would all say, no, in our original state prior to the fall, human beings were superior to the angels. Having bodies is what made us superior. So having a body is a good thing for the Christians. Second, what else do we have? Christians will say God is not a monad, but God is triune. He's a triad. He's a trinity. And the third, God becomes a human being. So God enters the world of change, the world of matter, the world of becoming, and through what's called hypostatic union, he becomes a hylomorphism of the divine essence, the human essence in this one being, which we call Christ. Okay? These are the major differences between Christianity and Neoplatonism. But in any case, the Neoplatonics, unlike Christians, they see this world as a prison. Okay, so what happens? This world is a prison. We're stuck here. But eventually, our body, which is composed of water and earth, will die. And the soul, which is composed of air and fire, will return up to the Empyrean. So what is the Empyrean? The Empyrean is the outest realm of the universe. So in the Neoplatonic schema, Earth is at the center of things. Everybody believed Earth was at the center of things for thousands of years, right? It's only recently that people have tried to make the claim that that's not the case. I'm not going to get too much into it. But the point is, Earth is at the center. And outside of the Earth, you have the moon. And the moon changes, because when you look at the moon, sometimes it's full, sometimes it's not. And so everything from the moon downward is what's called the sublunary realm, where we experience change. When you go beyond the moon, you have the realm of the planets, which the Neoplatonics, as well as the Christians, as well as the Islamic thinkers, all said were perfect. So Venus does not change. Mercury does not change. They didn't know about sunspots, so the sun is perfect and unchanging. The sun also, right, revolves around the earth. The earth does not revolve around the sun. And we go up through all the different levels of the celestial hierarchy. And the highest possible level, the outermost ring, is the Empyrean, which is made up of fire and air. Primarily fire, because the air burns up. Well, why fire and air? The idea is earth and water move to the center of the universe. Like if I drop a rock, it goes down. It goes towards the center of the universe. If I spill a cup of water, it goes down. It goes towards the center of the universe. No evaporation, okay? They don't believe in that. And air and fire naturally go up. Air's tendency is to go upwards, and fire's tendency is to go upwards. And so the idea is that all the air and fire in the universe will eventually make their way to the outermost ring, which is called the Empyrean. And beyond the Empyrean, we're in the realm of being, eternal form, contemplation of the one, so on and so forth. And so our soul belongs to that realm. And so when we die, the earth and water of our bodies will remain here, but our soul, made of air and fire, will return back to the Empyrean to eternally contemplate God. Okay, that's the Neoplatonic schema. But while we're here on earth, we can remember certain aspects of what it was like to be in the Empyrean realm or beyond the Empyrean realm, contemplating the absolute, the one, the monad, the God. Well, how do we remember that? Through philosophy. So we come to realize that that all things have causes, that there must be an absolute unmoved mover, an absolute cause of the universe. We come to realize that certain actions are good or bad, so there must be some sort of absolute good, not just like relative goods. We come to realize certain things are true and false, so we must realize there's an absolute truth. We come to see beauty. Beauty is a recollection of our time in this previous realm. Like all these different things that philosophy can teach us remind us of what it was like to be in the Empyrean for Plato. And so that's sort of the goal of life, is to remember again through the contemplation of truth, through the contemplation of beauty, through living a morally correct life, what it was like to live in the Empyrean. And that those who fulfill what their soul wants, which is to live a life of truth, goodness, and beauty, ultimately end up being the happiness. They end up being the happiest. This is like the Neoplatonic schema in a nutshell. Now, it gets way more complicated than that. There are a million different variations. But why do I bring this up? Emerson is super influenced by this. But Emerson's key distinction from the Neoplatonists is to say this world is not hell. And he's going to say something different from the Christians, because you're going to notice the Christian schema is Neoplatonism inversed. So mankind is created in this earth. Earth is the center of the universe. Earth is actually, when it is created with Eden, the best place in the entire universe. The angels, metaphorically speaking, are jealous of human beings. They're jealous of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve fall, the earth becomes the worst place in the entire universe, because the earth experiences death, experiences sin, experiences change. And so the idea is we start out in the best place, and then we move to the outer realm of the universe when we die to experience the beatific vision with the contemplation of where our soul contemplates God. But actually, at the end of time, in the eschaton, when Christ comes again, all of the souls that contemplate God after death in the beatific vision will return back to earth in the valley of Jehoshaphat, where Christ will come to judge the living and the dead, separate the goats from the sheep, and there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, meaning human beings will return to earth and it'll be perfect, and it'll actually be even better than Eden. The idea is that at the end of time, earth will be even better than Eden, and we'll have glorified bodies they'll glow, we'll be able to walk through walls, we'll have agility, we'll have all these different abilities that we don't have now. We won't ever get sick, we won't ever get tired, we'll always be happy, our happiness will always be growing, right? So every moment will be a happier moment than the previous moment. We'll always be growing in knowledge of God, so on and so forth. But notice how it's the opposite. A Neoplatonist says we start in the Empyrean, we come to this prison house of earth, and we return to the Empyrean. Christian says we start on earth, we go out to the Empyrean, but then we ultimately return to earth again. So it's the opposite. Emerson says, get rid of the distinction. All things are just the same thing. Matter does not exist. There is only form. There is only soul. Matter is an illusion. So any change that you perceive, people dying, people getting sick, getting tired, getting hungry, those are just illusions. Those are just part of, let me see if I can go back and find it. Those are just part of the veil of Maya. Those are illusions. And in fact, Emerson, in the second series of essays, writes an essay about the death of his son, where he died, I think, when he was 6 years old, where he says, it touches me not. And people interpret this as being very harsh. In a certain sense, obviously, it is very harsh. But Emerson really believes his ideas, which is that, no, his son has not died. Because first off, his son is just an externalization of him. His son is just the oversoul. It's just a mask of the eternal monad or the absolute. The same way, it's just Emerson projected outward. It's the absolute projected outward because Emerson is the absolute. And on top of that, his son never actually died because there is no death. That's just a mask or an illusion of the oversoul. It's not something that can actually happen, ever. Okay? So that is Neoplatonism, and that's Emerson's sort of draw from Neoplatonism, is he likes the Platonic emphasis on form. He does not think that, like the Enlightenment thinkers, what they do is they get rid of form. Go back to Locke and tabula rasa. Every truth that we have is just the result of sense perception. Hume, there is no such thing as truth. We just have increasingly accurate modes of predicting the universe by way of sense perception, and everything becomes reduced to matter. And so notice, in intellectual history, things are always swinging between opposites. So if the Enlightenment thinkers are going to say everything is just matter, Emerson's going to swing to the opposite direction and say, no, everything is just form. Everything is just idea. Everything is just the oversoul. Okay. Well, I told you we were going up. I told you we were going to be doing some really abstract stuff. So if you don't understand this, leave a question. Seriously, not only does it help the algorithm, which, hey, I could always use that, but like it helps me answer like these really complex ideas, because these ideas are fascinating. These are things I think about constantly, but they are complicated and they do take some time. So if you have questions, go leave them down below. I think we've covered everything in this first part on the philosophical foundations, other than Immanuel Swedenborg. Apologies for the awful low resolution photo. Swedenborg is another major influence on Emerson and on Transcendentalism. And so I am not an expert on Swedenborg, so I'm not going to pretend that I know everything there is to know about Immanuel Swedenborg, but I can say some relatively important things about him. So the reason he's so influential on Emerson, let's take this back a little bit. Emerson writes a series of biographies, a series of 7 lectures, short biographies, called Representative Men, where he basically says, like, Plato is the representative of the philosopher. Shakespeare is the representative of, I think he says, the writer. And Swedenborg is the representative of the mystic. Okay? And why is Emerson interested in Swedenborg? And who is Swedenborg? Well, he is a scientist, man of the Enlightenment. I think he's also a medical doctor. He does all these experiments. He's a professor of mathematics and geometry. He's like a thoroughgoing man of the Enlightenment. And then he starts to have these weird mystical experiences. He starts to investigate in, like, where does consciousness come from? Does it come from the pineal gland? Whatever. He starts having these insane mystical experiences that he writes about, where he claims he's visited heaven and hell. He's visited the 9 realms. He's talked to angels and demons. He went to a realm where there were little people, like, just in the ravings of a madman. And this becomes super popular because, think about it, for 2 reasons. One, people are beyond fed up with the Enlightenment stuff. And when a man of the Enlightenment all of a sudden starts having these weird mystical experiences, people open their eyes and go, okay, maybe there's a way of connecting the two. This is where you get like parapsychology and like all the paranormal, like the scientists of the paranormal. Swedenborg's kind of a precursor or a predecessor of that. Whereby, like, think about this. How do we connect science with things that go beyond science? How do we connect physics and metaphysics? And so Swedenborg has all these revelations that he writes about, and people become fascinated, and they create Swedenborgian churches where they take Swedenborg as being the gospel, the way the gospels are gospel. So they believe in all the canonical gospels, and Swedenborg's writings are also gospel. But it's a personal revelation. He has had these experiences that go beyond the physical realm, therefore, whatever. And in fact, he's very popular in America. Johnny Appleseed, who is a real person, there was a real Johnny Appleseed. If you're born in Ohio, you know that. Johnny Appleseed was a Swedenborgian. He was fascinated by Immanuel Swedenborg. He literally went around the country reading Swedenborg and throwing Appleseeds everywhere. That was Johnny Appleseed. You can go read about that. It's fascinating. But what Emerson likes about Swedenborg is the fact that he went through a similar trajectory. Emerson, too, went from being sort of a child of the Enlightenment to going beyond the Enlightenment. But what it proves is, within consciousness, we are capable of lifting up the veil and seeing realities that go beyond what we perceive as being reality. So the reality that I experience, there are the laws of physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. There's inertia. There are all these physical laws. But Emerson, at the end of Nature, is actually going to say, I think this is an exact quote. I'm almost positive this is an exact quote. Even in physics, the material is degraded before the spiritual. Repeat that again. Even in physics, the material is degraded before the spiritual. In the last passage of Nature, Emerson says you can actually you can lift up the veil and enter into alternate universes. You can lift up the veil and construct alternate realities. You could construct a reality where you're made out of pancakes. You could construct a reality where, whatever, you're you float and there's no gravity. Like you could get rid of all the laws of physics. They're not absolute. Emerson would say the only reason the laws of physics are absolute is because you believe they're absolute. At the ultimate level, everything is just oversoul. There's only one substance. There's no division. It's just being. It's just the monad. It's just the absolute. And so Emerson liked Swedenborg because Swedenborg showed that a man of the Enlightenment, one, could become spiritual and mystic the way Emerson had. But that two, that beyond this reality of day-to-day life and day-to-day living, there exist other realities. And we can pierce the veil and enter those realities. And there exist an infinite number of realities because the oversoul is infinite, because the oversoul is God, which means that you are God. And all the things that you see even in this reality of illusion and maya are actually God. And they can be changed because God is infinite. Therefore, how could we ever exhaust the possibilities of matter? You want matter, you want to become rich, think yourself rich. You can make yourself rich. In fact, that's where we get all of the later thinkers of what is called the New Thought. So if you know like Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, that title, the idea that you can use positive thinking and sort of will yourself to riches and wealth is Emersonian. And lo and behold, if you go read Napoleon Hill, you will know Napoleon Hill, huge devotee of Emerson. He quotes Emerson constantly in his mastermind sessions where he claims to like have these sort of they're like parapsychic meetings with like the souls of various writers and thinkers. Like he meets Washington and he meets Emerson. He talks to Emerson because he loves Emerson. And Emerson's the foundation of everything Napoleon Hill believed. And Napoleon Hill seriously thought, no, if you want to become rich, it's not about doing things out there in the external world. It's about assuming the mentality of wealth. Because why? Wealth and money are just projections of your own mind. They're just the oversoul. It's just maya. Okay? Very abstract. So please, if you have questions, ask them. I'm going to take a breath. We've covered a lot. I am feeling tired, but I'm going to keep going because this is awesome, and I don't want to stop this and split this into two parts. So, because now we're getting into the good stuff. And you know it's good stuff because I took away the images. Okay, I took away the images. The reason why I took away the images is just so you can concentrate on the terms themselves and also like what image is going to represent world of being, world of becoming. I'm not going to find anything good. So we're using this kind of cheeky style. You got to forgive the bad PowerPoints, but it's what I got. The information's what's important, not the PowerPoint. But so we're entering part 2, metaphysics and cosmology. So two terms you have to know, and this is just a general philosophical education. Anyone who studies philosophy needs to know these terms: immanence and transcendence. So the way I think about this is that they're opposites. It's inside and outside. And you're going to notice all of these terms are opposites, and they all relate to each other, actually. So immanence is the world of the here and now. It's the world of change, of becoming, as I'll explain in a minute. So if you have an experience of immanence, that is living in the present moment. The power of now, like Eckhart Tolle's type stuff, is like, let's say you're at a party, there's music playing, you're moderately drunk, and you have this like intense moment of happiness that you just grasp onto and wish it would last forever. That's, to a certain extent, an experience of immanence. Now, philosophically, immanence goes beyond that. But immanence is about the here and now, the point, the finitude, right? It's trying to take what is finite, the moment, and make it infinite. Make it last forever. Looking for the infinite in the here and now. That's what Eckhart Tolle says in The Power of Now. I hate Eckhart Tolle, but whatever. Transcendence is the opposite. It's trying to see all that is as being nothing more than a single moment. So everything you could possibly conceive, the entirety of the universe, is this, that, the other, is just one moment. Or looking at the moment for signs of that which is eternal. Okay? It's a bit contradictory, but transcendence, again, is what transcends material reality. In immanence, you're sort of immersing yourself in a material reality and trying to grasp onto it for something. Whereas transcendence is, how can I go beyond material reality? How can I go back to that world of the Empyrean, the world of the absolute, remember what it was like to be nothing more than a soul without a body in the Empyrean, these types of things. And so philosophers, broadly speaking, have categorized themselves into one of two schools. So Plato, for example, was a philosopher of pure transcendence. For Plato, this world was only significant as a referent to a previous world, the world of becoming, the world of being. And philosophers opposed to Plato, chiefly Heraclitus, one of the pre-Socratics, right? Obviously, he's not literally opposed to Plato. But like Heraclitus will say, this world is nothing more than change. Heraclitus will say there are no essences. So like the idea of there being a universal table is a fiction that exists in your mind. Heraclitus is a pure nominalist. Heraclitus would say, we invent the idea of table. No two tables are alike. Heraclitus' great quote, you can't step in the same river twice. He is a philosopher purely of immanence and of becoming. Everything is in change. Everything is in flux. There is no eternally constant thing, not even God. Heraclitus would say everything is changing constantly. Whereas Plato is like, yes, this world changes, but we can find signs in this world that point to something that transcends this world to a world outside of this world. Okay? So philosophers, broadly speaking, there are philosophers of immanence, there are philosophers of transcendence. And so people try to label philosophers on this basis, right? Plato is a philosopher of transcendence. Heraclitus is a philosopher of immanence. Plotinus is a philosopher of transcendence. Occam is a philosopher of immanence, which is actually not true. Nietzsche is a philosopher of immanence. Deleuze is a philosopher of immanence, right? Whereas, I don't know, Heidegger deals with transcendence, okay? These are the different groupings. I know some people are going to dispute me, particularly on the Heidegger one. Whatever, that's fine. The point is, you have these different groupings. Actually, Heidegger as a philosopher of transcendence is awful. Let's scrap that. Kant as a philosopher of transcendence. Okay, there we go. But the idea is, you have these two groupings: philosophers of immanence, philosophers of transcendence. Okay, moving forward. Forgive me on the Heidegger comment. I don't even know how that came out of me. Anyway, world of being, world of becoming. So this goes back to Plato. And so Plato is going to say, again, we come from the world of being. Why is it called the world of being? Because God is, as Aquinas will say as well, ipsum esse subsistens, the very nature of existence itself. So all the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty, apply to existence itself. Because think about it, if it wasn't better to be than to not to be, to take the line from Hamlet, if existing was worse than not existing, we would, in a certain sense, all have the moral obligation to commit suicide. And that's actually that's how Albert Camus opens The Myth of Sisyphus, which is, if existence were not good, we would all have to kill ourselves immediately. And going back to this, like, even the forms participate in existence. Existence is the floor of all possible ideas. So it's the floor of matter, because obviously if you're talking about an actually existent table, a table that exists, well, it has the property of existence, does it not? But the idea of table, even though you can't perceive it with your sense, you don't have sense perception of the idea of table, the idea of table also exists. And so it has a floor that, like, yes, like the idea of tableness has a certain goodness, beauty, truth, but it also shares the property of existence. And so for Plato, God, the monad, the absolute, is being, is ipsum esse subsistens. It's the very nature of to be. God is absolute being, actualized being. For Aquinas, for Aristotle, for the Islamic thinkers, like, that's true for in Hinduism, that's true for pretty much everybody, is that God is being itself. And so the world of being is the world of eternal, unchanging forms and ideas. Whereas the world of becoming is the world that we're in, where nothing is eternal and unchanging, where everything is constantly in a state of flux. I get angry, I get tired, I get hungry, I get sick, I die, I sleep, I wake up, whatever. Like, I'm constantly changing. Nothing is eternal in this world that you and I live in. But there are certain signs that signify a world that is absolute and unchanging. And so Plato, as I've mentioned before, sees this life as a way for us to look back at the life of being. And you'll notice, being pertains to transcendence, becoming pertains to immanence. Okay, you're starting to notice the connections. Now we have form and matter. Matter is actual physical objects. Form is the idea which they participate in. So a chair is like, it's made out of leather, it has, whatever, all these different material properties that a physicist could figure out. But a metaphysicist, right, a metaphysician could look at a chair and say it participates in goodness, it participates in existence, it participates in unity, it participates in oneness because it's a singular chair, right? Like, all these different abstract ideas which the chair participates in, a metaphysician could look at the chair and talk about form. And you're going to notice form pertains to the world of being, matter, that which changes, pertains to the world of becoming. Okay, you're starting to notice a pattern. We are beings of form and matter. We are what Aristotle would call hylomorphic beings. Because why? We have bodies that are matter, that change, that are in the world of becoming, and that experience immanence, right? Think of all the bodily pleasures, like intense sexual pleasure, intense pleasure from drugs, intense pleasure from like a very emotional experience. Like things that you experience in your body, those intense bodily pleasures, they pertain to matter. You have those experiences because you have a body, and those are experiences of immanence. And they change. They like bodily pleasure does not last forever. It goes away pretty quickly. Whereas form relate to the soul, to the part of you which is eternal and unchanging, the soul. And that participates in the world of being and participates in transcendence, because you can use your soul to have transcendent experiences, to go beyond this life and realize what this life really is. This is classic Platonism. Other terms that will be used, Aquinas is going to use these: essence versus substance. Okay, substance is just another way of saying matter. Essence, what a thing actually is the same thing as talking about its form. So the form of a human being is the same thing as the essence of a human being. When you define what it is to be human, that is the essence. That is the form. That is the universal pre-existent idea that allows me to look at various in-hypostasized human beings, like actual human beings, and say, it's Stacy and she has red hair. You know, that's Tom and he has blonde hair. That's John and he's tall. That's whoever. But I can look at them, and in spite of the fact that they have differences in matter because of the world of becoming, because of the different changes, because of different imperfections, I can identify them all as being human beings, as participating in the same essence or as participating in the same form. Okay? Qualitative versus quantitative. So the quantitative, the world of number, participates to the world of matter, because we can only describe matter, or at least matter is principally described by quantitative judgments. So how many of something are there? How dense is it? How much volume does it take up? What's its perimeter? Like all the questions that physics can answer about objects are quantitative judgments. Physics cannot tell you, I don't give a shit what any physicist has to say about this. Physics and science in neurochemistry will never tell you why something is beautiful. It cannot do that. It cannot make aesthetic judgments. It cannot tell you why something is or is not moral. We may get AI that can parrot human judgments about morality, but morality pertains to the soul. Beauty pertains to the soul. All we can talk about in terms of pure matter, like actual judgments about material objects, as material objects, they pertain to quantity. And you notice in our own time period where everything is about matter, where we've reduced the transcendent as having no sphere in public life or private life, we're always talking about quantitative judgments. How efficient is something? How much profit is it generating? How much space does it take up? Like, we are talking in quantity all the time. We talk very rarely about quality. We talk very rarely about qualitative judgments of morality, of beauty, of transcendence, of like any sort of abstract quality of objects or of beings. We tend not to use them, and those tend to be reduced. And there's a phenomenal book on this I would highly recommend, another philosophical book that's changed my life. Take a look at René Guénon's The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times. It's a phenomenal meditation on this. But again, quantity pertains to the realm of becoming, of matter, quality to the realm of being, to the realm of the absolute, to form. Okay? Macrocosm, microcosm, the distinction between the macrocosmic and the microcosmic. Now, this gets into something really interesting in Emerson. Now, and this is another Neoplatonic doctrine that shows up in Gnosticism, that shows up in all these early Christian heresies, which is, because this world is a reflection of the eternal, you can contemplate any aspect of this life, so for example, your own body, other bodies, other objects, nature, and through it, pierce through the veil to understand what is eternal and transcendent. And so every layer of reality for a Platonist exhibits the same properties of a higher reality. So let me give you an example that was totally intelligible to a Platonist, and that was also intelligible to early Christians, because they use this too. If I look at a leaf, well, they didn't know about cell theory, but you get the idea. If I look at a leaf, I notice it's composed of cells. If I look inside the cells, I notice there's an organizational structure where you get the different organelles. If you look at the different organelles, you notice there are different structures of like biochemical proteins and things I don't know about. But the point is, all those layers of reality exhibit organization and hierarchy. Because when you go beyond the leaf, there you have the hierarchy of the different organs of the tree. The trees make up a forest. The forest makes up an ecosystem. Like you have all these different hierarchies at each level of nature. You've got the apex predator, you've got the prey. Within the prey, you have like the different cells, right? Like everything is showing hierarchy and organization. And so the idea is, I can then generalize this and go, there's hierarchy and organization in my body. There are hierarchy and organization out in the natural world. Therefore, hierarchy and organization must participate in all levels of being. There's an organic relationship between all levels of being, which is why you'll see this in Plotinus's The Enneads, right? With literally the nines, the study of nine. This is where we get the idea there are 9 hierarchies of angels. That like 9 has a special sort of philosophical, theological significance because there are hierarchies, and the hierarchy of 9 makes sense because if you have a hierarchy between 2 things, there has to be an intercommunicator between the 2 things, and that's the third. And so the most perfect hierarchy is a hierarchy in which there are 3 hierarchies. Each like the middle hierarchy participates between the lower 2 hierarchies, but like you have intercommunication going in all the different places. This is the idea of like this also exists on Earth, but that's a macrocosmic and a microcosmic relationship. And so macrocosm and microcosm are going to become very important for Emerson because what Emerson is going to say is, this is getting ahead a little bit, but this is the doctrine of correspondence. Emerson's going to say, if you look out in nature, you're looking at a countryside, you're looking at a lake, you're looking at a mountain pass, you're looking at a desert. What are you seeing? You're seeing yourself. You're seeing the oversoul. You're seeing all that is, the absolute, the one, the eternal, the monad, reflected outwards in space and time, which are also illusions, which are also part of the veil of Maya. And if you are wise, you will be able to lift up that veil and realize it's just an extension of yourself. But the doctrine of correspondence basically says every material object is illustrative of a higher truth, with the highest truth being the eternal oneness and unity of all things, that all things are God. But Emerson would actually say, and he says this in Nature, Emerson's like, if you look at early words that we use, philologically speaking, for like good and bad, early word sinister, okay, coming from the left. We talk, or like for another example, we talk, this one actually makes more sense. We talk about someone being crooked if they're bad. And so Emerson says, we essentially looked to nature to develop in language moral metaphors that describe higher levels of existence. So there's a microcosmic and macrocosmic relationship between nature. So when I look out at a tree and I realize the crooked branch is not as useful as the straight branch, that allows me to make a higher generalization about goodness and evil. It lets me move up to higher levels of reality. And reality is always participating in these different hierarchies of microcosm, macrocosm. And so the idea here would be something like, you can understand any level of reality by the understanding of one thing. So Emerson would say, if I contemplated a leaf perfectly, I could understand the entire universe. I could understand all of calculus, I could understand all of physics, I could understand the deepest secrets of the universe. Because why? The leaf is the oversoul. The leaf is itself infinite. The leaf is God. The leaf is not a finite material object. The leaf is God. If I studied myself eternally, if I just looked inside myself and studied myself and studied myself and studied myself, I would come to know about the entire universe. Because I am the entire universe. There is a microcosmic and a macrocosmic relationship between all things. This is a key idea for Emerson. It may sound a bit vague now. If you have questions about it, put it in the chat. But that's a key idea. And it relates into another Gnostic idea that Emerson borrows, which is organicism. The idea that the entire universe is an organic, living entity. So, in this case, God or the oversoul, which is absolute and unchanging. But Emerson says, essentially, we can use the organic metaphor to describe these different levels of reality. And this actually does end up having a practical application because Thoreau is very interested in the idea of organicism. And believe it or not, Thoreau comes up with the concept of ecology because of Transcendentalism. Because Thoreau looks at a forest and says, isn't it interesting that the ecosystem, what we would now call an ecosystem, that like the forest and the biome and the like natural environment itself exhibits the same homeostatic properties of an organism. It tries to survive, it has regulatory measures, it like does all the things an organism does. You can think about this in relation to the Gaia hypothesis as well, which basically says the earth has regulatory mechanisms, that the earth functions like a cell, that it functions like a living being. Well, where did Thoreau get this idea of the ecosystem, that a forest or a biome could be a living thing and that could experience like self-regulation the same way a living thing can? He got it from Transcendentalism, and he got that ultimately from going back to Neoplatonism and the early Christian heresies. Because the idea is, no, the entire universe functions like an organic element. That at any level of the microcosm, macrocosm, we see the same types of organizational structure. And so by looking at one thing, you can understand the entire thing. And so Thoreau thought, well, if I look at an animal and I see regulatory measures like It's the animal sweats when it's too hot to cool it down. It shivers when it's too cold to keep it warm. And I see the same regulatory measures in play in a forest, where the prey and the predator remain in certain proportions, where like certain things happen every so often to keep things in check, just like of its own accord almost. Well, might there not be a relationship between those two things? So this is a unique transcendentalist idea. And the last one, pantheism versus panentheism. So I talked about this earlier. Emerson is a pantheist. Emerson legitimately believes that all things are God. All things are the oversoul. And if you're at like a low level of reality where you experience difference between things, where you say, the chair is not me, I am not my son, I am not you, I am not the television, I am not whatever, the water, that's because you're at a low level of reality. And if you lift up the veil of Maya, you will come to see that all things are God. Now, how do you lift up the veil is the question we're going to get to next. But Emerson is not a panentheist. He's not trying to say God is in all things. So a panentheist would say God is present in all things, but that God exhausts material reality, that there ultimately is a transcendent realm. Emerson does not believe in a transcendent realm. What Emerson is trying to do, and this is actually why I appreciate Emerson, even if I don't necessarily agree with him, he's trying to collapse the immanent and the transcendent into one thing. No. If you become immanent, if you contemplate the leaf long enough, the immanent physical material reality of the leaf, boom, you'll come out the other side transcendent, understanding the entire nature of the universe as all things just being one. And vice versa. If you contemplate the eternal oneness of all things, the leaf makes sense, right? Like there's a wormhole between the two things, which gets to the chief Emersonian idea. So we're going to talk about core transcendentalist ideas. We've talked about the oversoul already. We've talked about the doctrine of correspondence. The key Emersonian idea is this idea of self-reliance, which, why did I put Nietzsche's rock here? Well, it's extraordinarily influential on Nietzsche. Nietzsche actually calls Emerson a brother soul, which is the highest praise Nietzsche gives of any philosopher. And to give it to a random American is like kind of crazy. But I think Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch has a lot to do with Emerson, because in Emerson's Self-Reliance, Emerson gives sort of a formula for the Übermensch. Well, what does Emerson say in Self-Reliance? It's quite an interesting claim that he makes. Emerson's whole Self-Reliance is an essay ultimately about ethics, where Emerson says you should just do whatever you want. You should focus on being immanent. You should focus on being a unique individual and not doing things because of tradition, conformity, family, lineage, nationality. You should do nothing because some pre-existing social structure tells you to do it. So do not have a religion of tradition. Do not do what your ancestors did. Do not, like anything. You should just do what you want to do. You should just be yourself. This is where we get, just be yourself. This is from Emerson. Emerson is the first person to go, just be yourself, okay? Well, why? Why would I want to be myself? Well, Emerson says, by being yourself, you become more individual. And this is the Transcendentalist paradox. By becoming more of an individual, by becoming more particular, by becoming more immanent, you eventually, like, I'm being myself, I'm being immanent, I'm doing all my weird, wacky, unique individual things, I'm following my individual passions and desires. I become so much myself that boop, I pop out the other side, and now I'm transcendent. I have the experience of I have become so much myself that I realize that there is no myself. All things are me and I am all things. There is only the one, there is only the oversoul, there is only the monad. This is a big Emersonian idea. That's self-reliance. It's the ethics of Emersonianism. Because what Emerson's going to say is there are only two things. And this is still within the veil of Maya. But Emerson's going to say to lift up the veil of Maya, you have to be yourself. You have to be a unique individual, and that will allow you to become enlightened and to realize that all things are just the oversoul. But going forward, what Emerson is going to say in Self-Reliance is effectively, listen, there is no such thing as good or bad in an absolute moral sense. Badness is doing things that are not particular to you. And goodness is following your intuition and doing things that are particular to you. And so he actually has an exchange with a Puritan, like as an interlocutor in Self-Reliance. And the Puritan says, well, how do you know those impulses have not come from demons? You say follow your impulses, do what you feel like, follow your bliss, just be yourself. Well, what if the impulses telling you to be yourself are from demons to lead you to perdition? And Emerson's famous response is, well, if I'm the devil's child, then I will continue to be of the devil's party, right? That's not an exact quote. But the point is, Emerson says, I will do what I want to do. And if I have to do evil, I'll do it. But I can only be myself. You cannot judge me on moral basis. That's to limit me in some way. Very Nietzschean, because Nietzsche is going to say in the genealogy of morals, morality is basically invented to shackle the strong individuals. Well, what Emerson is going to say is very similar, which is, I just need to be myself and do my own thing. And no one can judge me for being myself. And if I continue to be myself, I will eventually have a transcendent experience in which I realize all things are actually the same thing. All things are me. I am all things. I am the oversoul. I am God. God is me. And I have pierced through the veil and seen through the illusions. But I'll only be able to do that if I am self-reliant. So self-reliance is not like pick yourself up by your bootstraps, sort of the Ben Franklin, Horatio Alger type stuff. It's actually a metaphysical doctrine which says, no, pierce through the veil of Maya by becoming yourself, by not listening to morality and religion of revelation and tradition, but just doing what you want to do. And the last term, I should have given this a different image. That's fine. It's from Thoreau, Civil Disobedience. And so Thoreau, in his famous essay, Civil Disobedience, which of course you probably know, it's influential on so many people. It's influential on Tolstoy. It's influential on Gandhi. It's influential on Martin Luther King. The whole philosophy of nonviolent resistance comes from civil disobedience, which of course is a pun. It's civil disobedience because it's disobedience to civil society, but it's also civil disobedience because Thoreau is not like throwing Molotov cocktails and flipping over cars. It's nonviolent resistance. What Thoreau says in civil disobedience is he's like, the law ultimately shackles the individual. And so if let's say I'm me, I'm a self-reliant, crazy individual, okay? I'm doing my self-reliant, crazy individual things. I'm just being myself. I'm not listening to what people want me to be. I'm just being me. And I'm not going to be shackled by any morality, any religion. I'm only going to do what I want. And if I adhere to a system of morality or a religion, it's because it's internal to myself. And by doing this, I'm going to lift up the veil. Well, in that quest of lifting up the veil, I'm going to come into conflict with others. And what do I do when I come into conflict with civil society? So in Thoreau's case, he says, I don't want to pay the poll tax. Why don't I want to pay the poll tax? Because it's going to go fund the Mexican-American War. Well, I don't believe in the Mexican-American War, so I can't pay the tax. So he says, you just civilly disobey. When the law obliges you to do something that is against your individual morality, you have to follow your individual morality with religious adherence. So, for example, the same way that like if a law obliged a Christian to renounce Christ, he would choose death. It was like, okay, you renounce Christ or you die. Well, a Christian would choose death. Thoreau says do the same thing, essentially, but for like your personal preferences in your individuality. So like if I don't believe in the Mexican-American War, I'm not going to pay taxes that fund it. And if the government says, well, we're going to put you in jail for tax evasion, then put me in jail for tax evasion, but I have to be me. I have to be me. And so if I have to come into conflict with a family structure, with a societal structure, with an entire state, or even the entire world, I am going to do it because I have a moral obligation to be self-reliant. And that's why Emerson says, actually, and I would agree with this, like self-reliance is not, at least completely, just an excuse to be a hedonist. Emerson says it's actually harder to be self-reliant than it is to just follow a prescribed, pre-existing morality because there are no support structures. It's just you, and you have to adhere to that reality with the same religious adherent that the Christian would adhere to not renouncing Christ. But it's all about your personal preferences. And so for that reason, Thoreau says, civil society is ultimately not as important as doing what you want to do. And so if your preferences come into contact with civil society, so much the worse for civil society. It's very Thoreauvian. We'll get to that when we get to civil disobedience. I am exhausted. This has been an hour and 20 minutes. I did manage to get it under 90 minutes, which is good. We've covered a ton of Transcendentalism stuff. Hopefully this has been helpful. If it has, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, ask me a question. I appreciate you guys watching this. I hope you're getting a lot out of this as well. And as always, I would be remiss if I didn't mention I have some programs you may be interested in. If you're wondering like how I managed to get this philosophical education, how much do I read a day, like if you want to live an intellectual life, like what are the things you have to do? What type of music should you listen to? What type of films should you watch? All the sort of self-help stuff that exists for people who want to start businesses and people, who want to start going to the gym, but that doesn't exist for people who want to start reading and improve their intellectual life. I created a 22-part lecture series that it's in development. It's not fully done, but you can pre-order it down below. Take a look at it. I think if you look at the topics covered, you're going to be astounded because, quite frankly, nothing like this exists. It's advice that I wanted to give to myself now, right? If I could give it to myself when I was 15, would have changed my life, and maybe it'll change your life too. So go give that a look. Thanks again for watching. Take care, guys. I will see you all next time.